Sometimes the things the world throws away are exactly what we need most. Sometimes a gentle soul sees worth where others see nothing but trouble. In 1887 Arizona Territory, old Walt Garrison has one animal left in his failing corral, a giant donkey nobody wants. The townspeople call it worthless, too big and too stubborn. Walt's ready to quit. Then little Yiska, an Apache girl, walks up and speaks to the donkey in her language. She names it Biidii, meaning hope. Something changes. The animal becomes gentle and wise. People start coming to see this strange pair. The town begins to change too. But this story isn't really about a donkey. It's about what happens when someone believes in you when no one else will. What could one child's faith teach an entire frontier town about second chances? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The weathered trading post sign creaked in the morning breeze, its paint so faded you had to squint to make out the words, "Garrison's Livestock and Feed." Walt Garrison stood in the doorway of his modest adobe building, coffee cup in hand, watching the sun paint the desert mountains in shades of amber and rose. At 70, his once broad shoulders had begun to curve inward, and his steel-grey hair had thinned to wisps that refused to stay put under his worn hat. But his eyes, pale blue like winter sky, still held the quiet intensity that had served him well in his younger days. Copper Springs, Arizona Territory, wasn't much to look at in the autumn of 1887. A collection of sun-bleached buildings scattered. Along a dusty main street, it clung to existence like a desert flower after a brief rain. The town had sprung up around a reliable water source and the hope of mining prosperity that never quite materialized. Now it served primarily as a way station for travelers heading to more promising destinations and as a trading hub for the scattered ranchers and farmers trying to scratch a living from the stubborn earth. Walt's trading post sat on the eastern edge of town, where the desert began its slow climb toward the distant mountains. Behind the building, a series of corrals and holding pens had once housed dozens of horses, mules, and cattle waiting for new owners. Now only one pen remained occupied, and by an animal that had become something of a local curiosity, or joke, depending on who you asked. The donkey was enormous, easily the size of a draft horse, with a coat the color of charcoal and ears so large they seemed to catch every sound for miles around. Walt had acquired him 6 months ago from a Mexican trader who claimed the animal was blessed by God but cursed by the devil. The trader had been eager to part with him for a price so low that Walt should have known better, but business had been slow, and Walt thought surely someone would want such a magnificent specimen. He'd been wrong. Every potential buyer took one look at the donkey and walked away, shaking their heads. Too big for riding, they said, too stubborn for pack work, too strange-looking to be trusted. Some of the more superstitious folks in town had taken to calling him cursed, whispering that no good could come from an animal that looked at you with such knowing eyes. Walt took another sip of his coffee and studied the donkey, who stood motionless in his pen, as if posing for a portrait. There was something unsettling about the way the animal watched everything, as if he understood far more than any donkey had a right to. Walt had named him Goliath for his size, but the name had never seemed to stick. The donkey responded to it when called, but without enthusiasm, as if he were merely being polite. "Morning, Goliath," Walt called out. The donkey's ears swiveled forward, and he took a few steps closer to the fence, but said nothing, not even the customary bray that most donkeys offered as greeting. Walt's failing business wasn't entirely the donkey's fault, of course. His eyesight had been deteriorating steadily over the past year, making it difficult to assess animals properly or to keep accurate records. More than once, he'd mistaken a mare for a gelding, or failed to notice a limp until a buyer pointed it out. Word got around in a small community, and trust, once lost, was hard to rebuild. The railroad had reached Tucson 2 years ago, changing everything. Livestock could now be shipped by rail faster and cheaper than driving them overland. The days of the independent livestock trader were numbered, and Walt knew it. At 70, he was too old to start over and too proud to admit defeat, but defeat seemed to be staring him in the face every morning when he opened his door. A movement caught his eye, a small figure walking along the path that led from the Apache settlement 3 miles southeast of town. Even from a distance, Walt recognized the purposeful stride of 8-year-old Yiska, though he still struggled with her name. The Apache girl visited Copper Springs twice a week with her grandmother, trading hand-woven baskets and beadwork for supplies they couldn't make or grow themselves. Walt had noticed the child before, of course. Hard not to notice someone so small, moving with such quiet confidence. She had the kind of presence that made you pay attention, not because she demanded it, but because something in her bearing suggested she was worth watching. Her dark hair was usually braided with small ornaments that caught the light, and she wore a mixture of traditional Apache clothing and practical frontier dress that her grandmother had sewn. Today, she was alone, carrying a leather bag that probably contained whatever her grandmother hoped to trade. Walt had heard from Catherine Mills, the schoolteacher, that the old Apache woman had been feeling poorly lately. Ayana was her name. A woman of perhaps 65 who moved through town with the dignity of someone who had seen much and judged little. The relationship between Copper Springs and the nearby Apache was complicated, like most things on the frontier. There had been trouble in years past, raids, misunderstandings, and the kind of violence that left scars on both sides. But the Apache in this area had mostly settled into an uneasy peace with their white neighbors. They kept to themselves, traded when necessary, and caused no trouble. In return, the townspeople tolerated their presence and occasionally even welcomed their trade. Walt watched Yiska approach the main street, her small hand clutching a carved wooden doll that never seemed to leave her side. The doll was clearly Apache-made, with intricate beadwork on its tiny dress and real hair braided just like the child's own. Walt had heard from the shopkeeper that the doll had belonged to Yiska's mother, who had died when the girl was very young. Her father, too, was gone, lost in one of the many conflicts that had swept through the territory in recent years. The girl paused at the edge of Walt's property, looking toward the corral where Goliath stood watching her with his usual intense attention. This wasn't unusual. Most children were curious about the giant donkey, but Yiska didn't point or giggle like the other children did. Instead, she stood perfectly still, studying the animal with the same serious expression she wore when examining vegetables at the general store. Walt set down his coffee cup and walked slowly toward the fence, his boots crunching on the dry ground. "Morning, little miss," he called out gently. "You can come closer if you want. He won't hurt you." Yiska looked up at Walt with dark eyes that seemed far too old for her young face. She didn't speak much English, or at least she rarely chose to speak it in town, but she nodded politely and took a few steps toward the corral. Goliath, who usually remained aloof when strangers approached, did something unexpected. He walked directly to the part of the fence closest to Yiska and lowered his great head until he was nearly at her eye level. The girl reached up slowly and touched his muzzle with her small fingers. "Well, I'll be," Walt murmured. In 6 months, he'd never seen the donkey show interest in anyone. The animal tolerated Walt's presence and accepted food and water, but he'd never sought out human contact. Now he stood perfectly still while a child stroked his nose, his ears forward and his eyes half closed in what could only be described as contentment. Yiska began to speak softly in Apache, her voice barely above a whisper. Walt couldn't understand the words, but the tone was unmistakable. Gentle, soothing, almost musical, she was telling the donkey something important. He could sense that much. Goliath listened with the kind of attention Walt had seen dogs give their masters, but never from a donkey. After several minutes, Yiska stepped back and looked up at Walt. "His name is not Goliath," she said in careful English, her voice soft but clear. Walt blinked in surprise. It was the first time he'd heard her speak English, and her pronunciation was better than he'd expected, "Oh, what do you think his name should be?" The girl considered this seriously, looking back at the donkey who continued to watch her with those knowing eyes. "Biidii," she said finally. "It means the one who brings hope." Something shifted in that moment, though Walt couldn't have said exactly what. The morning air seemed clearer, the sunlight warmer. Even Goliath Biidii seemed to stand a little straighter, as if he approved of his new identity. "Biidii," Walt repeated, trying to get the pronunciation right. "That's a fine name. A fine name indeed." Yiska smiled then. The first real smile Walt had ever seen on her serious young face. It transformed her completely, revealing the child. She was beneath the grave dignity she usually wore like armor. "I must go," she said, hefting her leather bag. "Grandmother is waiting." "Of course," Walt said. "You're always welcome here, you know. Biidii seems to like you." The girl nodded solemnly and continued toward town, leaving Walt standing by the corral with a head full of questions. Behind him, the donkey, Biidii, let out a soft whicker, the first sound Walt had ever heard him make that seemed genuinely happy. Walt turned back toward his trading post, but paused when he noticed something different about the wooden sign. Hanging above his door, the morning light was hitting it at just the right angle to make the faded letters clearly visible for the first time in months. "Garrison's Livestock and Feed." It looked almost new again, as if someone had touched up the paint while he wasn't looking, but that was impossible, of course. Walt rubbed his eyes and looked again. The sign was as weathered as ever, the paint still faded to near invisibility. Just a trick of the light, he told himself. Just an old man's failing vision playing games with him. Still, as he went back inside to start his day, Walt found himself humming, something he hadn't done in longer than he could remember. Behind him, Biidii stood at his fence, watching the path where a small Apache girl had walked toward town, carrying with her a carved wooden doll and the memory of a donkey who had finally found his true name. 3 days later, Walt woke to an unusual silence. He'd grown accustomed to the sounds that marked his mornings, the distant lowing of cattle, the creak of his windmill, the soft shuffling of Biidii moving about his pen. But this morning brought an unnatural quiet that made him uneasy. He dressed quickly and stepped outside, coffee forgotten in his haste. The sun was already well above the horizon, which meant he'd overslept. Another sign of his advancing years that he preferred not to dwell on. But what drew his attention wasn't the lateness of the hour, but the sight of Yiska standing at Biidii's fence, alone. The girl had never come by herself before. She always traveled with her grandmother, Ayana, whose steady presence seemed to anchor the child's more adventurous impulses. Walt approached slowly, not wanting to startle her, but Yiska seemed entirely at ease despite being unaccompanied. "Morning, little miss," Walt called softly. "Where's your grandmother today?" Yiska looked up from where she'd been stroking Biidii's neck. The donkey stood perfectly still for her touch, his usually alert ears relaxed and his eyes half closed with contentment. "Grandmother is sick," she said in her careful English. "She cannot walk to town today." Walt felt a stab of concern. Ayana might keep to herself, but she'd always struck him as a remarkably healthy woman for her age. If she was too ill to make the journey to Copper Springs, it must be serious indeed. "I'm sorry to hear that," Walt said. "Is there anything I can do? Medicine from town, maybe?" Yiska shook her head. "She has medicine, Apache medicine. She will be well soon." The girl's voice carried the kind of certainty that only children possess, but Walt detected a trace of worry beneath her confident words. "Well, if you need anything at all," Walt began, but stopped when he noticed what Yiska was doing with her free hand. She was speaking to Biidii in Apache again, but this time she was also making gestures, as if she were conducting a conversation, rather than simply talking to an animal. More remarkably still, Biidii seemed to be responding. Not with words, of course, but with movements of his head, subtle shifts of his weight, and soft sounds that Walt had never heard from him before. It was as if the girl and the donkey were sharing secrets in a language Walt couldn't begin to understand. Yiska reached into the leather pouch she always carried and pulled out something that made Walt's breath catch. It was a small silver medal, tarnished with age, but still clearly recognizable as military decoration. A cavalry medal, unless Walt was much mistaken, the kind given for service in the Indian Wars. The girl held the medal up to the morning light, turning it so the weak sunbeam caught its surface. Biidii watched with intense interest, his dark eyes following the glint of silver. "Where did you get that?" Walt asked, though he dreaded the answer. There were too many ways an Apache child might come by a cavalry medal, and none of them were. "Pleasant to contemplate. It was my father's," Yiska said simply. "Grandmother says he was brave. She says he died protecting our people from bad soldiers." The words hit Walt like a physical blow. He gripped the fence post to steady himself, memories rushing back unbidden. Images of burning wickiups, of women clutching children, of his own commanding officer shouting orders that made Walt's stomach turn. The silver medal in Yiska's small hands looked exactly like the one he kept hidden in his bedroom drawer, the one he'd been awarded for his service in the Apache campaigns. The one he'd never been able to look at without feeling sick. "Your father," Walt said carefully. "What was his name?" But Yiska had already turned back to Biidii, speaking to him in rapid Apache. The donkey listened with that same intense attention, then did something that made Walt's knees nearly buckle. Biidii lowered his great head and gently touched his muzzle to the medal in Yiska's hand, as if he were paying his respects. "Biidii understands," Yiska said, looking back at Walt with those ancient eyes. "He knows about soldiers. He knows about being far from home." Walt wanted to ask more, needed to ask more, but the sound of approaching hoofbeats interrupted his thoughts. A small group of townspeople was riding up the path to his trading post, more visitors than he'd seen in weeks. Leading them was Catherine Mills, the schoolteacher, riding side saddle on her gentle mare. "Walt," Catherine called out as she dismounted, "we heard the most extraordinary thing. People are saying your donkey has been, well, transformed somehow, that he's become gentle and intelligent, almost tame." Behind Catherine came the banker, Morrison Fletcher, along with his wife and two of the more prominent ranchers in the area. Walt felt a familiar knot of anxiety in his stomach. Fletcher had been pressuring him for months to sell his property, claiming that the railroad would eventually want the land for expansion. "Morning, Catherine," Walt said, tipping his hat. He was acutely aware of Yiska standing beside him, still, holding her father's medal. "I'm not sure I'd call it a transformation exactly. May we see him?" asked Mrs. Fletcher, peering over the fence with the kind of curiosity usually reserved for circus attractions. "The stories we've been hearing are simply incredible." Walt wanted to say no, wanted to send them all away and protect whatever fragile magic was happening between Yiska and Biidii. But he was also a businessman, and these were the first potential customers he'd seen in weeks. "Of course," he said reluctantly, "though I should warn you, he's not for everyone. He's particular about his people." The visitors gathered around the corral, chattering excitedly among themselves. Biidii, who had been so gentle and responsive with Yiska, immediately reverted to his usual aloof demeanor. He moved to the far side of the pen and stood with his back to the fence, ignoring the humans completely. "He doesn't look very gentle to me," Morrison Fletcher observed with a skeptical frown. "Still looks like that same stubborn beast you've been trying to unload for months." Walt felt heat rise in his cheeks. "He's not stubborn, just particular, and he's not for sale to just anyone." But even as he spoke the words, Walt realized how foolish they sounded. Here were potential buyers, the first he'd seen in ages, and he was essentially telling them they weren't good enough for his donkey. Yiska stepped forward then, moving with that quiet confidence that always surprised adults. She walked to the fence and spoke a single word in Apache. Biidii's ears swiveled immediately toward her voice. She spoke again, longer this time, and the great donkey turned and walked calmly to where she stood. The effect on the watching townspeople was immediate and dramatic. Catherine gasped audibly. Mrs. Fletcher clutched her husband's arm, and the ranchers began muttering to each other in amazement. Biidii positioned himself directly in front of Yiska and lowered his head so she could scratch between his ears. "Good," "Lord," whispered one of the ranchers, "I've never seen anything like it." "How does she do that?" Catherine asked, her voice filled with wonder. Walt found himself at a loss for words. He could hardly explain that an 8-year-old Apache girl seemed to possess some kind of mystical connection with his donkey. It sounded absurd, even in his own mind, but the evidence was right there in front of them. "She has a way with animals," Walt said finally, which was both true and completely inadequate. Morrison Fletcher stepped closer to the fence, his businessman's instincts clearly aroused. "This changes things considerably, Walt. If that animal really has been tamed, he could be worth significant money. Show animals, entertainment, that sort of thing." The idea made Walt's skin crawl, though he couldn't say exactly why. The thought of Biidii being displayed like a circus curiosity, separated from the girl who had somehow awakened his gentle nature, seemed fundamentally wrong. "He's not a show animal," Walt said firmly, "and he's not tamed. He just knows good people when he meets them." Yiska looked up at him then, and Walt saw something like gratitude in her dark eyes. She said something to Biidii in Apache, and the donkey stepped back from the fence, taking up his usual position in the center of the pen. But he didn't turn his back on the visitors this time. Instead, he watched them with what could only be described as dignity, as if he were a king graciously receiving subjects. The transformation in the townspeople's attitude was remarkable. Where moments before they had seen a stubborn, worthless animal, they now saw something special, something worth talking about. Walt could practically see the wheels turning in their minds, the stories they would tell when they returned to town. As the visitors prepared to leave, Catherine lingered behind. "Walt," she said quietly, glancing at Yiska, "that child, she's remarkable. The way she handled that animal was, well, it was almost magical." "She's got a gift," Walt agreed, "though I'm not sure her grandmother would appreciate her coming here alone." "Perhaps I could speak with Ayanna," Catherine suggested. "If the girl has such a way with animals, she might benefit from some formal education. There are opportunities for people with special talents, even—" She paused delicately. "Even Apache children," Walt finished for her. Catherine nodded, color rising in her cheeks. "Yes, even Apache children. The world is changing, Walt. It's time we changed with it." After the visitors departed, Walt turned to find Yiska still standing. By the fence, her father's medal clasped tightly in her hand. She was watching him with an expression he couldn't quite read. "Thank you," she said simply. "For what?" "For not selling Biidii to the showman." Walt felt something shift inside his chest, a loosening of tensions he didn't even know he'd been carrying. "Biidii belongs with you," he heard himself say. "I wouldn't sell him to someone who couldn't understand that." Yiska smiled then, that transformative smile that changed her whole face. "Grandmother will be better soon," she said. "Then I will come with her, and she can meet Biidii properly." "I'd like that," Walt said, and meant it more than he'd meant. Anything in years. As Yiska walked away, heading back toward her grandmother's settlement, Walt remained by the corral. Biidii approached the fence and stood quietly beside him, as if they were both watching over the girl's safe journey home. For the first time in months, Walt felt something he'd almost forgotten how to feel: hope. It was fragile and uncertain, but it was there, sparked by the faith of a child who believed a giant donkey could be gentle and a worn-out old trader could be worthy of trust. The silver medal in Yiska's hand caught the sunlight one last time before she disappeared from view, and Walt found himself wondering about the story behind that medal and dreading the day he might have to tell her his own part in that story. That evening, Walt sat at his kitchen table with a leather-bound journal he hadn't opened in nearly 2 years. The pages were yellowed with age and filled with his careful handwriting, records of livestock transactions, weather observations, and the occasional personal reflection. He'd started keeping the journal during his cavalry days, a habit that had served him well through the transition to civilian life. Now, with his pen hovering over the first blank page he'd encountered in months, Walt struggled to find words for What had happened that day? How did a man describe watching a child breathe life into a creature that had seemed resigned to being unloved? How did he capture the feeling of watching his failing business suddenly attract more visitors in one morning than he'd seen in weeks? Finally, he began to write. The Apache girl, Yiska, came alone today. Grandmother is ill. Something has changed with Biidii since she named him. Cannot explain it, but the animal is different. More alert, more responsive. The townspeople are taking notice. He paused, pen still hovering above the page, then added, she carries her father's cavalry medal. Apache brave, she says, died protecting his people from soldiers. Makes me wonder what her father would think of his daughter befriending an old cavalry officer. The admission sat heavy on the page, the first time Walt had acknowledged in writing what he'd spent 20 years trying to forget. He closed the journal and pushed it aside, but sleep didn't come easily that night. The next morning brought Yiska again, this time accompanied by her grandmother. Walt had been watching for them from his kitchen window, curious to meet the woman who had raised such an extraordinary child. Ayana moved slowly, but with purpose, leaning slightly on a walking stick carved with intricate designs. Even from a distance, Walt could see the family resemblance, the same serious dark eyes, the same quiet dignity. When they reached the corral, Biidii was already waiting at the fence. Walt marveled again at the donkey's apparent ability to sense Yiska's approach long before she came into view. The great animal stood perfectly still as both the girl and her grandmother studied him with identical expressions of thoughtful evaluation. Walt approached carefully, hat in hand. "Good morning," he said, nodding respectfully to Ayana. "I'm Walt Garrison. Your granddaughter has been keeping my donkey company." Ayana regarded him with eyes that seemed to see straight through to his bones. When she spoke, her English was precise and unaccented, surprising Walt with its formality. "I am Ayana. I have heard about this animal from Yiska. She says he understands Apache words." "He seems to understand her anyway," Walt replied. "More than he's ever understood me, that's certain." Yiska had already begun her usual conversation with Biidii, speaking in rapid Apache, while the donkey listened with what could only be described as rapt attention. Ayana watched this interaction with the kind of intense focus that made Walt wonder what she was seeing that he was missing. "My granddaughter has always been different," Ayana said quietly, not taking her eyes off the girl and the donkey. "Even as a small child, she spoke with animals as if they were people. Her mother was the same way." "Her mother," Walt ventured. "Carefully, was she?" "Dead these 6 years," Ayana said with matter-of-fact sadness. "Killed by soldiers who could not tell the difference between warriors and families fleeing for safety." Walt's stomach clenched. 6 years ago would have been 1881, the year of his last campaign, the year everything had gone wrong, the year he'd failed to prevent a massacre that still haunted his dreams. Before he could respond, Yiska called out something in Apache that made both adults turn their attention back to the corral. Biidii had moved to the gate and was standing with his nose pressed against the latch, making soft, whickering sounds. "He wants to come out," Yiska announced in English. "He says the pen is too small for proper conversation." Walt blinked. "He says what now?" But Ayana was already moving toward the gate, her expression thoughtful. "Open it," she told Walt. "Let us see what happens." "Ma'am, I'm not sure that's wise. He's a large animal, and if he decides to run, he will not run," Yiska said with absolute confidence. "Biidii is not a running-away animal. He is a staying-with-his-people animal." Against his better judgment, Walt unlatched the gate. Biidii stepped out calmly and immediately positioned himself between Yiska and the adults, as if he were presenting himself for inspection. The donkey's behavior was so dignified and deliberate that Walt found himself fighting the urge to tip. His hat in return, Ayana approached slowly and extended her hand toward Biidi's muzzle. The donkey sniffed delicately, then allowed her to stroke his neck. She spoke to him in Apache, longer sentences than Yiska used, with the cadence of someone telling a story. "What is she saying?" Walt asked Yiska. "Grandmother is telling him our family's story," the girl replied. "About my mother and father, about the old times before the soldiers came. She is asking if he remembers the old ways." Walt watched in fascination as Biidii seemed to listen to every word. When Ayana finished speaking, the donkey lowered his head and touched his muzzle to her outstretched palm, a gesture of unmistakable respect. "He remembers," Ayana said softly, looking directly at Walt. "This animal has seen many things. He knows sorrow, and he knows healing." The moment was interrupted by the sound of approaching hoofbeats. A well-dressed man on a fine bay horse was riding up the path to Walt's trading post, and Walt's heart sank when he recognized Morrison Fletcher. The banker had been pressuring Walt to sell his property for months, and Walt had hoped their encounter yesterday might have satisfied his curiosity. Fletcher dismounted and approached the small group, his eyes immediately drawn to Biidii standing, free outside his pen. "Good morning, Walt. I see you've let your prize animal out for exercise." "Just letting him stretch his legs," Walt replied carefully. He was acutely aware of Ayana and Yiska watching this interaction, and something in the banker's tone put him on edge. "I've been thinking about our conversation yesterday," Fletcher continued, pulling out a folded document from his coat. "I'd like to make you a proposition. I'm prepared to offer you triple what that animal is worth on the regular market, plus a generous price for your land and buildings." Walt felt the blood drain from his face. "Triple what he's worth? Why would you?" "Because he's worth more than livestock now, Walt. He's a curiosity, a trained performer. There are people in the entertainment business who would pay handsomely for an animal that responds to commands in Indian languages. Think of the novelty value." The words hit Walt like a slap. Behind Fletcher, he saw Yiska step closer to Biidii, her small hand resting protectively on the donkey's neck. Ayana's expression remained neutral, but Walt caught the slight tightening around her eyes that suggested she understood exactly what Fletcher was proposing. "He's not for sale," Walt said firmly. "Not to you, not to anyone in the entertainment business." Fletcher's genial mask slipped slightly. "Be reasonable, Walt. Your business is failing. Your eyesight is getting worse every month. How long do you think you can hold on to this place? The railroad is coming through this area within 2 years, and when it does, this land will be worth 10 times what I'm offering now. Then I'll sell to the railroad when the time comes." "The railroad won't want to deal with individual property owners, Walt. They'll buy in bulk from investors who have already consolidated the land. Investors like me." Walt felt the net closing around him, but before he could respond, Yiska spoke, up in her clear, careful English. "Biidii is not a show animal," she said, looking directly at Fletcher. "He is a friend. Friends are not for buying and selling." Fletcher looked down at the girl as if he'd just noticed her presence. His expression shifted from surprise to calculation. "You're the Apache girl who has such a way with the beast, aren't you? Remarkable. With proper training, you could be part of the show. A genuine Indian maiden and her mystical donkey. Audiences would eat it up." The silence that followed Fletcher's words was so complete that Walt could hear his own heartbeat. Ayana's face remained impassive, but Walt caught the slight movement of her hand toward the knife she wore at her belt. Yiska simply stared at Fletcher with those ancient eyes, as if she were seeing something in him that disappointed, but didn't surprise her. It was Biidii who broke the silence. The great donkey stepped forward and placed himself directly between Fletcher and Yiska, his ears pinned back and his nostrils flaring. For the first time since Walt had owned him, Biidii looked genuinely dangerous, I think, Walt said quietly. "You'd better leave now, Fletcher." The banker looked from the protective donkey to Walt's determined face to Ayana's steady gaze, and apparently decided that discretion was the better part of valor. "Think about my offer, Walt. It won't stay on the table forever." As Fletcher rode away, Walt realized his hands were shaking. He'd just turned down more money than he'd seen in years, and for what? For the sake of a donkey and a child who wasn't even his responsibility. But when he looked at Yiska's relieved smile and saw Ayana nod at him, With something that might have been approval, Walt knew he'd made the right choice. Some things, he was learning, were worth more than money. Over the following days, Walt found himself looking forward to Yiska and Ayana's visits with an anticipation that surprised him. The girl had begun arriving earlier in the mornings, often appearing at the corral while Walt was still drinking his first cup of coffee. Her grandmother usually followed an hour later, carrying a small turquoise medicine pouch that she wore around her neck like a talisman. Walt had always been a solitary man, comfortable with his own company and the quiet routines of his trade. But something about Yiska's presence changed the texture of his days. She had begun helping him with small tasks, sorting through old harness leather, organizing his cluttered office, even assisting with the care of Biidii. Her small hands were surprisingly skilled, and she approached every task with the same serious concentration she brought to her conversations with the donkey. "Why do you write in the book?" she asked one morning, finding Walt making notes in his leather journal. She was sitting cross-legged in the dirt beside Biidi's pen, braiding wild grass into intricate patterns while the donkey watched her work with fascination. "To remember things," Walt replied, looking up from his careful recording of the previous day's weather. "Prices, dates, important events. Memory isn't always reliable, especially as you get older." Yiska nodded solemnly. "Grandmother keeps memories in stories. She says if you tell a story right, it stays alive forever." "That's true," Walt agreed. "But stories can change over time. Writing helps keep the facts straight." "What facts do you write about Biidii?" Walt glanced at the donkey, who was now lying down in his pen, something Walt had never seen him do before Yiska's arrival. "I write about how he's changed since meeting you, how he's become gentler, more responsive, how he seems to understand things." "Do you write about me?" The question was asked with such innocent directness that Walt felt his cheeks warm. "Sometimes. I write about how you help with the animals, how you're teaching me Apache words." It was true. Over the past week, Yiska had begun sharing simple Apache vocabulary during their morning conversations. Shash for bear, mai for coyote, wee for horse. Walt dutifully recorded each new word in his journal, along with Yiska's patient corrections of his pronunciation. "Grandmother wants to know why you help us," Yiska said, not looking up from her grass braiding. "Apache people and white people do not always help each other." Walt set down his pen and considered his answer carefully. It was a fair question, and one he'd been asking himself. "Your grandmother is right to be cautious. There have been too many times when help came with hidden costs, but sometimes—" He paused, searching for words that would make sense to an 8-year-old. "Sometimes people just recognize kindness in each other. You were kind to Biidii when no one else was. That tells me something important about who you are." Yiska looked up from her work then, studying Walt's face with those discerning dark eyes. "Grandmother says you have soldier eyes. She says soldier eyes usually mean danger for Apache people." Walt felt his breath catch. "What do you think?" The girl considered this with the same serious attention she gave everything else. "I think you have sad soldier eyes, not angry soldier eyes. Sad eyes are different." Before Walt could respond, the sound of approaching horses interrupted their conversation. Catherine Mills was riding up the path, accompanied by Dr. Samuel Henderson, the town's physician. Walt rose to greet them, wondering what could have brought the doctor to his remote trading post. "Morning, Walt," Catherine called as she dismounted. "Dr. Henderson wanted to see your remarkable donkey for himself." The doctor, a thin man in his 50s with kind eyes behind wire-rimmed spectacles, approached the corral with professional interest. "I've been hearing fascinating stories about animal behavior modification. As a man of science, I confess I'm curious about the methods involved." Walt glanced at Yiska, who had risen from her seat and was now standing protectively near Biidii. The donkey had also gotten to his feet and was watching the newcomers with his usual alert attention. "There aren't any methods, Doc," Walt said. "Just a girl who has a way with animals." Dr. Henderson pushed his spectacles up his nose and studied. "Yiska, with the same scientific interest he'd shown the donkey. Remarkable. And you're the Apache child I've heard about? The one with the special gift? Yiska nodded politely but said nothing. Walt noticed she was holding her turquoise medicine pouch, not the one that belonged to her grandmother, but a smaller version that Ayana had recently given her. It seemed to give the girl comfort in unfamiliar social situations. I wonder, Dr. Henderson continued, if I might observe this phenomenon. I'm particularly interested in the apparent communication between child and animal. Biidii doesn't perform tricks, Walt said firmly, remembering Fletcher's unwelcome suggestions. And Yiska isn't a curiosity to be studied. Catherine stepped forward with a gentle smile. Of course not, Walt, but Dr. Henderson has been treating some of the Apache families in the area. He's genuinely interested in understanding different approaches to healing, including the relationship between people and animals. This information cast the doctor's request in a different light. Walt looked to Yiska, leaving the decision to her. After a long moment, she nodded and approached the corral fence. What followed was the same quiet magic Walt had witnessed many times before, but seeing it through the eyes of educated strangers gave him new appreciation for its uniqueness. Yiska spoke to Biidii in Apache, and the donkey responded with the kind of attention usually reserved for beloved family members. She asked him to move to different parts of the pen, and he complied immediately. She requested various behaviors, lowering his head, lifting a foot, standing perfectly still, and Biidii performed each action as if he genuinely understood not just the words, but the reasons behind them. Dr. Henderson watched in fascination, occasionally making notes in a small notebook. When Yiska finished her demonstration, he approached the fence with obvious respect. "That was extraordinary," he said softly. "I've seen trained animals before, but this is something quite different. The communication appears to be genuinely two-way." "Biidii talks back," Yiska agreed matter-of-factly. "Not with words, but with his body. He tells me when he's happy, when he's worried, when he wants to go outside the pen." "And you learned this how?" Yiska glanced at Walt, then back at the doctor. "Grandmother says all animals talk. Most people just forget how to listen." Dr. Henderson made another note. "Your grandmother sounds like a wise woman. I've been wanting to meet her, actually. Some of the Apache families have mentioned her knowledge of traditional medicines." "She makes good medicine," Yiska confirmed, "but she is careful about sharing it with white people. Too many times white people have taken Apache knowledge without permission." The simple statement carried weight that made both Dr. Henderson and Catherine shift uncomfortably. Walt felt a familiar stab of shame, recognizing another echo of the historical injustices that shadowed every interaction between his people and Yiska's. "Perhaps," Catherine said carefully, "there could be an exchange of knowledge, Dr. Henderson, as medical supplies that might benefit the Apache community, and your grandmother's traditional remedies might complement his modern treatments." Walt saw Yiska's expression brighten with interest. "I will ask grandmother. She likes helping people, but she needs to trust them first." Dr. Henderson closed his notebook and smiled. "Trust must be earned, of course. Perhaps I could start by examining your grandmother's health if she's been feeling poorly. No payment required, just a gesture of goodwill." As the visitors prepared to leave, Walt found himself reflecting on the changes that seemed to ripple outward from Yiska's simple act of kindness toward Biidii. What had begun as a girl naming a donkey was somehow becoming a bridge between communities that had maintained careful distance for years. After Catherine and Dr. Henderson departed, Walt returned to his journal, but found himself staring at the blank page for long minutes. How did a man record the feeling of watching walls come down, of seeing possibilities where there had been only resignation? Finally, he wrote, "Dr. Henderson visited today, impressed by Yiska's connection with Biidii, discussion of knowledge exchange between Apache and white communities. The girl continues to amaze me with her wisdom and courage. Sometimes I think she sees solutions that escape the rest of us entirely." He paused, then added, beginning to understand that Biidii didn't just find his true name when Yiska called him Biidii. We all did. That evening, as Walt watched the sunset paint the desert mountains in shades of gold and purple, he found himself humming again. Yiska and Ayana had departed hours ago, but their presence seemed to linger in the air like the scent of desert flowers after rain. Biidii stood at his fence, ears pricked forward, as if he too were listening to some distant music. For the first time in years, Walt allowed himself to believe that tomorrow might bring something better than just another day of slow decline. Perhaps that 8-year-old Apache girl was right. Perhaps hope really could change everything, one gentle conversation at a time. Walt discovered his father's broken compass while searching through old boxes in his storage shed, looking for leather scraps that Yiska might use in her grass braiding projects. The brass instrument had been damaged years ago when Walt dropped it during a hasty retreat from an Apache ambush. The needle spun wildly now, unable to find true north, making it worse than useless for navigation. He stood in the dusty shed, holding the compass and remembering his father, a man who had never been lost in his life, who could find his way through any wilderness with nothing but the stars and his own steady sense of direction. Walt had carried the compass through 4 years of cavalry service, more as a talisman than a tool. He'd always seemed to know where he was going in those days, even when that direction led him places he'd later regret. "What is that?" Yiska's voice startled him from his memories. She had approached the shed with her usual silent grace, Biidii following close behind. Walt had finally given up trying to keep the donkey penned during the girl's visits. Biidii had developed an uncanny ability to work latches open with his teeth whenever Yiska arrived. "My father's compass," Walt replied, showing her the broken instrument. "It's supposed to point north, but it got damaged a long time ago." Yiska examined the compass with interest, turning it in her small hands. "Grandmother has one like this. She took it from a soldier who tried to hurt her family when she was young." Walt felt his stomach tighten, another reminder of the violence that had shaped the relationships between their peoples. "I'm sorry that happened to your grandmother. She says the soldier was lost," Yiska continued matter-of-factly. "He was angry and frightened, and he hurt people because he could not find his way home. She kept his compass to remember that being lost makes people dangerous." The words struck Walt like a physical blow. How many times had he been that lost, angry soldier? How many decisions had he made from fear rather than wisdom? "Can I show it to Biidii?" Yiska asked, apparently unaware of the turmoil her words had caused. Walt nodded, unable to trust his voice. Yiska held the compass up to the donkey's muzzle, speaking to him in Apache. Biidii sniffed the brass instrument delicately, then made one of his soft, whickering sounds, the ones he seemed to reserve for conversations with Yiska. "He says it's still useful," the girl reported. "Not for finding north, but for remembering that being lost is not the same as being broken." Before Walt could ask what that meant, the sound of multiple horses approaching interrupted them. Walt looked up to see a sight that made his blood run cold. Morrison Fletcher riding toward his property with 3 other men, including what looked like a county surveyor carrying measuring equipment. Walt shoved the compass into his pocket and stepped protectively closer to Yiska. "Stay near Biidii," he told her quietly. The donkey seemed to sense the tension, moving to position himself between the girl and the approaching riders. Fletcher dismounted with the confident air of a man who believed he held all the advantages. The surveyor and the other 2 men, Walt, recognized them as Fletcher's business associates from Tucson, began unloading their equipment without invitation. "Morning, Walt," Fletcher called out cheerfully. "I hope you don't mind, but I've brought some colleagues to have a look at your property. The railroad is moving faster than expected on their expansion plans. I told you before, Fletcher, the property isn't for sale." "Oh, but that's where you're wrong, my friend." Fletcher produced a legal document from his coat with a flourish. "You see, there's been a problem with your land ownership, some irregularities in the original filing, questions about proper surveying. The county is required to investigate such matters." Walt's heart began to pound. He'd inherited the property. from his predecessor in the trading business, and the paperwork had always been somewhat informal. In the chaos of territorial expansion, many land claims were based more on gentlemen's agreements than legal precision. "What kind of irregularities?" Walt demanded. The surveyor, a thin man with calculating eyes, stepped forward. "The boundaries described in your deed don't match the actual survey markers. There's a discrepancy of several acres, plus the question of water rights. This creek that runs through your property, the original Apache claim to this water source, was never properly resolved." Walt felt the ground shifting beneath his feet. "What does that mean?" "It means," Fletcher said with poorly concealed satisfaction, "that your ownership of this land is in legal dispute. Until the matter is resolved, the county has the right to prevent any transfer of the property. And if the original Apache claim is validated, well, this becomes government land, subject to sale for railroad right-of-way." Walt looked at Yiska, who was listening to this conversation with growing alarm. He could see her struggling to understand the legal complexities, but clearly grasping that her new safe haven was under threat. "The Apache families who used this land," Walt said carefully, "what happens to them in your scenario?" Fletcher shrugged dismissively. "Relocation, I assume. The government has policies for such things. There are reservations where they can be properly supervised." The casual cruelty of the statement hung in the air like a physical presence. Walt saw Yiska's hands tighten on Biidi's halter, and the donkey responded by stepping closer to her side. "How long do I have?" Walt asked, dreading the answer. "The survey will take several days to complete," the surveyor replied. "After that, there will be a county hearing to determine the validity of competing claims. If you can't prove clear title, the land will be seized for back taxes and immediately made available for development." Walt's mind raced through his limited options. His savings were minimal, nowhere near enough to hire the kind of lawyer who could fight this kind of legal maneuvering. He was being systematically cornered by men with far more resources and connections. "There is one alternative," Fletcher said, his tone suddenly reasonable. "I'm still prepared to make a generous offer for the property and all livestock. You could walk away with enough money to start over somewhere else. No legal complications." "And the Apache families who use this water source?" "Not your concern anymore," Fletcher replied coldly. "Business is business, Walt. Sentiment doesn't pay the bills." Walt felt something cold and hard settle in his chest. These men were threatening not just his livelihood, but Yiska's family and the fragile peace that had been building between the communities. The girl stood beside him, small and vulnerable, holding the halter of a donkey who had become the unlikely center of a brewing conflict. "I need time to think," Walt said finally. "Of course," Fletcher agreed magnanimously, "but don't think too long. These opportunities have a way of disappearing." As the men packed up their equipment and prepared to leave, Walt noticed that Yiska had pulled her father's cavalry medal from her pouch and was clutching it tightly. The silver caught the afternoon sunlight, sending small reflections dancing across Biidi's dark coat. "Mr. Walt," she said quietly after Fletcher and his associates had ridden away, "what will happen to Biidii if they take your land?" Walt looked at the girl's upturned face, saw the trust and concern in her dark eyes, and felt the full weight of responsibility settle on his shoulders. Somewhere in the past weeks, he'd become more than just a failed livestock trader. He had become someone whose choices mattered to people who depended on him. "I don't know," he admitted, "but I promise you this. I won't let them turn Biidii into a show animal, and I won't let them force your family away from your water source." Yiska nodded solemnly, then surprised him by reaching out and placing her small hand on his weathered one. "Grandmother says, when you cannot find your way, sometimes the path finds you instead." Walt looked down at his father's broken compass, still spinning uselessly in his pocket, and wondered if an 8-year-old Apache girl might be the wisest person he'd ever met. The handmade bridle was a work of art that took Yiska 3 days to complete. She worked on it during her morning visits, sitting cross-legged in the shade while Biidii watched her progress with obvious interest. The leather came from Walt's scrap pile, But Yiska's skillful hands transformed the weathered strips into something beautiful, intricate braiding, interwoven with small turquoise stones, and decorated with geometric patterns that seemed to tell a story. Walt watched her work with growing amazement, occasionally offering suggestions, but mostly just marveling at the girl's natural artistry. Her small fingers moved with the kind of practiced precision that spoke of generations of knowledge, passed down through her family. "Where did you learn to work leather like that?" he asked on the second day. "Grandmother taught me," Yiska replied without looking up from her braiding. "She learned from her mother, who learned from her mother. Apache women have always made beautiful things for their horses." "Biidii isn't exactly a horse," Walt pointed out with gentle humor. Yiska paused in her work and looked at the donkey, who was standing as close to her as the fence would allow. "He has the heart of a horse, the size of a horse, the dignity of a horse. What else matters?" When Catherine Mills arrived that afternoon for one of her increasingly frequent visits, she found Walt helping Yiska attach the finished bridle to Biidi's head. The donkey stood perfectly still for the process, as if he understood the significance of the ceremony. "My goodness," Catherine breathed, dismounting from her mare. "That's absolutely beautiful work." Yiska beamed with pride at the compliment, then spoke to Biidii in Apache. The donkey lowered his head so she could adjust the bridle's position, and Walt was struck again by the almost supernatural communication between the girl and the animal. Catherine approached the fence with obvious admiration for both the craftsmanship and the bond she was witnessing. "Yiska, that's the finest piece of leatherwork I've seen in years. You have remarkable talent." "Thank you," Yiska said politely, but Walt could see her pleasure at the praise. Compliments from adults were rare in her young life. "I've been thinking," Catherine continued, looking between Walt and the girl, "about what we discussed regarding education. Yiska has such obvious intelligence and skill. It would be a shame not to nurture those gifts properly." Walt felt a familiar tension arise whenever the topic of Yiska's future came up. He'd grown protective of the girl's daily presence, and the thought of changes to their routine made him uneasy. "What kind of education are you thinking about?" he asked carefully. "Well, basic literacy and arithmetic, of course. But beyond that," Catherine gestured toward the bridle. "There are schools back east that teach commercial arts, leatherwork, beadwork, textile design. Skills like Yiska's could provide her with genuine opportunities for independence." Yiska looked up from adjusting Biidi's bridle, her dark eyes serious. "What about Biidii? Would he come to school too?" Catherine smiled gently. "I'm afraid animals don't attend school, dear, but perhaps there could be arrangements. Weekend visits, holidays when you could come back to see him." Walt saw the girl's face fall at this suggestion, and he felt an unexpected surge of protectiveness. "Yiska and Biidii are partners," he said firmly. "Separating them wouldn't be kind to either one." "Of course not permanently," Catherine said quickly, "but surely you can see the value of expanding Yiska's horizons. She's too bright to spend her whole life." She paused, clearly struggling with diplomatic phrasing. "Living like an Apache," Walt finished for her, his tone sharper than he'd intended. Catherine colored slightly. "Living without the advantages that education could provide. The world is changing, Walt. Traditional ways of life are becoming more difficult to maintain." Before Walt could respond, the conversation was interrupted by a commotion from the direction of town. A small crowd was moving along the main road, and even from a distance, Walt could see they were in an agitated state. "What's all that about?" Catherine wondered aloud. The answer came in the form of 10-year-old Timothy Morrison, Fletcher's nephew, who came running toward the trading post with the kind of excitement that usually meant trouble. "Mr. Garrison! Mr. Garrison!" the boy shouted as he approached. "There's been an accident. A snake bit little Rebecca Patterson, and she's real sick." Walt felt his blood chill. Rebecca Patterson was the 6-year-old daughter of one of the local ranchers, a sweet child who often waved to him when her family came to town. "Where did this happen?" Catherine demanded. already moving toward her horse, down by Willow Creek, where the children go to play. A big rattler got her on the ankle. Dr. Henderson's with her now, but the boy's voice trailed off ominously. Catherine was already mounting her mare. I have to go help. Walt, can you? But Yiska was already moving, leading Biidii toward the gate with purposeful strides. We will come too, she announced. Yiska, I don't think that's wise, Walt began, but the girl was already opening the gate. Biidii knows about snake medicine, she said with absolute certainty. He will help. Walt stared at her. How could Biidii possibly know about snake medicine? Animals know things people forget, Yiska replied, mounting Biidii with the easy grace of someone born to ride. Grandmother says donkeys are very wise about poisons. They eat plants that make other animals sick, but donkeys know which plants heal and which plants harm. Despite his skepticism, Walt found himself saddling, his old gelding with urgent haste. Something in Yiska's certainty convinced him that this was not the time for rational objections. The ride to Willow Creek took only 10 minutes, but it felt like hours. Walt's aging horse struggled to keep pace with Biidii, who moved with surprising speed and grace despite his size. The donkey seemed to sense the urgency of their mission, his ears pricked forward and his gait steady. They found a crowd gathered around a blanket where little Rebecca lay pale and still. Dr. Henderson knelt beside her, his face grim as he worked to slow the spread of venom. The child's parents hovered nearby, their faces etched with the kind of helpless terror that Walt remembered from his own childhood fears. The bite is bad, Dr. Henderson said quietly to Catherine as she approached. I've done what I can to slow the poison, but without proper antivenom. He shook his head grimly. Yiska slipped down from Biidi's back and approached the circle of adults with the kind of calm authority that seemed impossible in such a young child. May I see? She asked politely. Mrs. Patterson looked uncertain, but Dr. Henderson nodded. Any help would be welcome at this point. Yiska knelt beside the unconscious child and examined the swollen bite mark on her ankle. Then she turned to Biidii, who had positioned himself as close to the group as possible and spoke rapidly in Apache. To Walt's amazement, the donkey immediately began moving through the surrounding vegetation, his nose to the ground as if searching for something specific. Within minutes, he had located a particular plant, one that Walt vaguely recognized as some kind of desert sage, and carefully uprooted it with his teeth. Biidii carried the plant back to Yiska, who accepted it with a murmured word of thanks. In Apache, she then looked up at Dr. Henderson with serious eyes. This plant will help, she said, but it must be prepared correctly. Do you have clean water? Dr. Henderson looked skeptical, but desperate enough to try anything. Yes, but I can't administer folk remedies without understanding. My grandmother is wise medicine woman, Yiska interrupted gently. I have watched her heal snake bites before. This plant draws poison from the blood, but only if prepared right. What followed was a delicate negotiation between traditional knowledge and modern medicine, with Yiska carefully explaining each step of the treatment, while Dr. Henderson assessed the risks. In the end, it was Rebecca's fading pulse that convinced him to allow the Apache remedy to supplement his own efforts. As they worked together, the young Apache girl, the frontier doctor, and the wise donkey who had somehow known exactly which plant to find. Walt felt something shift in the gathered crowd. Suspicion gave way to hope, prejudice dissolved into gratitude, and an 8-year-old child became a bridge between two very different ways of understanding the world. When Rebecca's color began to improve and her breathing steadied, the silence that fell over the group was thick with wonder and relief. Mrs. Patterson was crying openly, and even the normally stoic ranchers were wiping their eyes. How did you know? Dr. Henderson asked Yiska quietly. How did you know that plant would work? Yiska looked at Biidii, who was standing peacefully nearby, as if locating life-saving plants was just part of his daily routine. Biidii knew. He is very wise about healing things. As they prepared to return to the trading post, Walt overheard. Several conversations that would have been unthinkable just hours earlier. Plans for visiting Ayana to learn more about traditional remedies. Discussions about the value of Apache knowledge. Talk of cooperation rather than competition between different approaches to solving problems. That was remarkable, Catherine said as she rode alongside Walt and Yiska on their way home. I've never seen anything like it. Biidii is special, Yiska said simply, leaning forward to pat the donkey's neck. He sees connections that other animals miss. Walt looked at the handmade bridle adorning Biidii's head, a bridge between cultures, lovingly crafted by a child who seemed to possess wisdom far beyond her years. Maybe, he thought, some kinds of education couldn't be found in any school, no matter how prestigious. Maybe the most important lessons came from learning to listen to the wisdom that surrounded you every day, whether it came from a patient donkey, a wise grandmother, or a little girl who believed that healing was always possible if you knew where to look. The yellowed military orders arrived with Colonel James Patterson 3 days later, carried in a leather dispatch case that had seen better decades. Walt was grooming Biidii when he spotted the familiar blue uniform approaching his trading post, and his hands stilled on the brush as memories came flooding back. Patterson looked older, grey-haired now, with the kind of weathered face that spoke of too many years under harsh suns. But he still carried himself with the military bearing that had made him both feared and respected during the Apache campaigns. Walt hadn't seen his former commanding officer in nearly 20 years, not since the day he'd resigned his commission and walked away from military life forever. "Walt Garrison," Patterson called out as he dismounted from his cavalry horse. "You're a hard man to find." "James," Walt replied carefully, not moving from Biidii's side. The donkey seemed to sense the tension, stepping closer to Walt with protective instincts. "I didn't expect to see you again." "I imagine not." Patterson approached slowly, his eyes taking in the modest trading post, the single donkey. The obvious signs of a man living on the margins. "I heard you'd settled out here in the territory, been meaning to visit for years, but—" He shrugged. Army business always seemed to get in the way. Walt waited, knowing that Patterson hadn't ridden all this way for a social call. In the distance, he could see Yiska and Ayana approaching from their morning walk. The sight of the military uniform would terrify them, he knew, and he found himself stepping forward to block Patterson's view of the path. "What brings you out here, James?" Patterson's expression grew serious as he pulled the dispatch case from his saddle. "Unfinished business. Questions that have been eating at me for 2 decades. He opened the case and withdrew a bundle of documents. "Do you remember the summer of 1881? The incident at White Mountain Creek?" Walt's blood turned to ice. Of course he remembered. It was the day that had ended his military career, the day he'd failed to prevent a massacre that still haunted his dreams. "I remember." "Good. Because I've been carrying these orders around for 20 years, waiting for the right time to show them to you." Patterson held out the yellowed papers. "Read them, Walt. Read what your actual mission was that day." With trembling hands, Walt took the documents and unfolded them carefully. The ink had faded, but the words were still legible. As he read, his knees nearly buckled. The orders were clear and unambiguous. Sergeant Walt Garrison was to proceed to White Mountain Creek with a small detachment to protect Apache families who were attempting to surrender peacefully. He was to prevent violence against non-combatants and to ensure safe passage for women and children seeking refuge at the nearest military post. Walt looked up from the papers, his face white with shock. "But the attack, the burning, I was told that—" "You were told lies," Patterson said grimly, "by Captain Morrison, who had his own agenda that day. Morrison wanted those Apache families dead because they could have testified about his illegal arms trading with hostile tribes. He sent you out there with false information, hoping you'd arrive too late to save anyone." The world seemed to tilt around Walt as 20 years of guilt and self-recrimination crumbled in an instant. "You knew this? All these years you knew." "I was trying to save them, not—" "I suspected, but I couldn't prove it. Morrison was clever. He made sure the official reports painted you as a failed officer who couldn't follow orders. By the time I gathered enough evidence to challenge his version of events, you'd already resigned and disappeared. Walt's legs gave out, and he sank onto an overturned bucket beside Biidi's pen. The donkey immediately moved to stand beside him, as if offering comfort. "Morrison," Walt whispered. "Captain Morrison. Fletcher Morrison's father," Patterson confirmed. "Apple doesn't fall far from the tree, it seems. I've been tracking the family's business dealings across 3 territories. Railroad development, land speculation, always with a trail of legal irregularities and displaced communities." The implications hit Walt like a physical blow. Fletcher Morrison, the man who was trying to steal his land, who wanted to turn Biidii into a circus attraction and force the Apache families away from their water source, was the son of the man who had destroyed Walt's faith in himself and caused the deaths of innocent people. "The Apache families at White Mountain Creek," Walt said hoarsely. "Did any of them survive?" Patterson's expression grew somber. "A few. A woman named Ayanna managed to escape with her daughter and infant granddaughter. They made it to the reservation, but the daughter died of her injuries a few years later. The granddaughter, Yiska," Walt whispered, the pieces falling into place with terrible clarity. "You know them." Patterson's eyebrows shot up in surprise. Walt looked toward the path where Yiska and Ayanna had stopped, clearly afraid to approach while the soldier was present. The girl was clutching her grandmother's hand, and Walt could see the tension in both their postures. They've become friends, Walt said inadequately. "Yiska has a way with Biidii. She named him, taught him to trust again." Patterson followed Walt's gaze, and his expression softened when he saw the small Apache girl and the elderly woman. "The child, that's Ayanna's granddaughter, the baby who survived the massacre." Walt nodded, unable to speak. The irony was crushing. For months, he'd been building a friendship with the very people he'd failed to save 20 years ago, never knowing that his supposed guilt was based on lies. "There's more," Patterson said gently, sensing Walt's emotional state. "Morrison's business partner in the railroad scheme. It's Fletcher Morrison himself. They're using the same tactics his father used during the war. Legal manipulation, false documents, intimidation. They're trying to force you off land that legally belongs to the Apache families." "What do you mean, legally belongs to them?" Patterson pulled out another document. "Original treaty rights, never properly rescinded. This water source was guaranteed to Ayanna's band in perpetuity. The government never had the right to sell it to anyone else." Walt stared at the document, his mind reeling. Not only had he spent 20 years carrying undeserved guilt, but the land dispute threatening his home was built on the same foundation of lies and legal corruption. "Why are you telling me this now?" Walt asked. "Because I'm retiring next month, and I want to set some records straight before I go. And because Fletcher Morrison made the mistake of trying to bribe a federal land commissioner last week. We've been building a case against his railroad scheme, but we needed someone who could testify about his father's historical pattern of fraud and corruption. The eagle feather hair ornament had belonged to Yiska's mother, and Ayanna had kept it wrapped in soft deerskin for 8 years, waiting for the right moment to pass it on. She presented it to her granddaughter 3 days after Fletcher Morrison's arrest during a quiet ceremony beside the creek that ran through Walt's property, their property now. As the federal investigation had confirmed their treaty rights, Walt watched from a respectful distance as Ayanna spoke in Apache, her weathered hands gentle as she wove the sacred feather into Yiska's dark braids. The girl sat perfectly still. During the ritual, her young face solemn with the weight of inheritance and tradition. "She is telling Yiska about her mother's courage," Dr. Henderson explained quietly. He had become a regular visitor since the snakebite incident, eager to learn from Ayanna's traditional healing knowledge. "About the strength that runs in their family line?" Walt nodded, understanding that he was witnessing something profound. A passing of wisdom from one generation to the next, a recognition that Yiska was growing into someone who could carry the responsibilities of her heritage. The past 3 days had brought a whirlwind of official visits, legal proceedings, and media. Attention that had transformed Walt's quiet trading post into the center of a territorial scandal. Reporters from as far as Denver had arrived to cover the story of government corruption, Apache land rights, and the unlikely friendship between an old cavalry sergeant and the survivors of his unit's greatest failure. Through it all, Yiska had remained remarkably composed, answering questions with the same thoughtful precision she brought to her conversations with Biidii. But Walt could see the strain in her dark eyes, the way she sought out the donkey's calming presence whenever the adult world became too overwhelming. "The territorial governor wants to meet her," Catherine Mills said, approaching Walt with a telegram in her hand. "There's talk of a formal ceremony, recognition of the injustices done to her family, perhaps even a scholarship for her education." Walt accepted the telegram but didn't read it immediately. His attention was drawn to Yiska, who had finished the feather ceremony and was now walking toward Biidii with her new ornament catching the morning sunlight. "What does she want?" Walt asked, watching the girl stroke the donkey's neck while speaking to him in their private language of Apache words and gentle touches. "I beg your pardon? All these officials and reporters and well-meaning people, they all have plans for Yiska, but what does she want for herself?" Catherine followed his gaze to where the girl and donkey stood together, and her expression softened with understanding. "She's still just a child, Walt. Children need adults to make difficult decisions for them, do they?" Walt found himself thinking of all the adult decisions that had shaped Yiska's young life, the policies that had displaced her people, the violence that had killed her parents, the legal manipulations that had threatened her family's water rights. Maybe children sometimes see solutions that escape the rest of us. Before Catherine could respond, Colonel Patterson approached from the direction of the main road. He had been staying in town for the past several days, overseeing the federal investigation and preparing for the various legal proceedings that would flow from Fletcher Morrison's arrest. "Walt," he said, his expression serious, "we need to discuss the hearings scheduled for tomorrow. Morrison's lawyers are going to challenge everything. Your testimony about the White Mountain Creek incident, the validity of the Apache land claims, even the authenticity of the military orders I've provided." Walt felt his stomach clench with familiar anxiety. "What does that mean?" "It means we need the strongest possible case. The territorial court is under political pressure to resolve this quickly and quietly. Too many powerful people have invested too much money in Morrison's railroad scheme. And if we lose," Patterson's expression grew grim, "if we lose, Morrison walks free, the Apache families lose their water rights, and you lose your property to forced sale. Everything goes back to the way it was, except Morrison will be more careful about covering his tracks in the future." Walt looked toward Yiska, who seemed to sense the tension in the adult conversation. She approached them with Biidii following close behind, her new eagle feather ornament giving her an air of dignity that made her seem older than her 8 years. "There will be a trial?" she asked, her English clear despite the complexity of the concept. "A hearing," Patterson explained gently, "where we tell the judge our side of the story, and Mr. Morrison's lawyers tell theirs. The judge decides who is telling the truth." Yiska considered this with her usual serious attention. "Will Biidii be allowed to come?" The question caught all 3 adults off guard. Walt found himself imagining the august territorial courthouse with a giant donkey in attendance and nearly smiled despite the gravity of the situation. "I'm afraid not, dear," Catherine said gently. "Courtrooms are only for people." "That is too bad," Yiska said matter-of-factly. "Biidii is very good at knowing when people are lying." Walt blinked, struck by the simple wisdom of the observation. In the months since Yiska had named him, Biidii had indeed shown an uncanny ability to judge character. He was gentle with children and honest adults, but he became agitated around people like Fletcher Morrison, people with hidden agendas and cruel intentions. "She's right," Walt said slowly. an idea beginning to form. Biidii does seem to know things about people that the rest of us miss. Patterson looked skeptical. Walt, I appreciate the sentiment, but we can't base a legal case on a donkey's character judgment. Why not? Yiska asked with genuine curiosity. Animals know many things people have forgotten. Biidii knew which plant would help the snake bit. A girl. He knew Mr. Morrison was a bad man before any of us did. He knew you were a sad soldier, not an angry one. Her words hung in the air, and Walt found himself remembering all the times Biidii's behavior had provided insight into human nature. The donkey's immediate trust of Dr. Henderson, his protective stance around Yiska, his calm acceptance of Ayana, despite her initial wariness. There might be something to that, Catherine said thoughtfully. Not as legal evidence, of course, but as a way of helping people understand the deeper truth of what happened here. Walt felt a spark of inspiration. What if we brought the hearing here, instead of to the courthouse? Patterson frowned. That's highly irregular. Court proceedings have established protocols. Exactly, Walt interrupted. Established protocols that have allowed injustices to continue for decades. What if we ask the judge to see the land that's in dispute, to meet the people whose rights are being violated, to understand what's really at stake here? The idea gained momentum as Walt spoke, and he could see Catherine's eyes light up with understanding. A field hearing. It's been done before in territorial disputes, especially when the land itself is central to the case. Patterson looked uncertain. It's risky, Walt. Judges prefer the controlled environment of a courtroom. Out here, with all the emotional factors. That's exactly why it might work, Walt said, his conviction growing. In a courtroom, this becomes about legal technicalities and document interpretation. Here, it becomes about people, about a grandmother trying to protect her granddaughter's future, about a child who sees possibility where adults see only problems. Yiska had been listening to this exchange with growing excitement. And Biidii could show the judge how gentle he really is, how he helps people instead of hurting them. Walt looked at the girl's hopeful face, then at the donkey who had somehow become the center of their small community. Biidii stood quietly beside them, his dark eyes alert and intelligent, as if he understood that important decisions were being made. It's worth requesting, Patterson said finally. Judge Crawford is known for his unconventional approaches. He might be intrigued by the idea. As they discussed the logistics of their unprecedented request, Walt found himself thinking about the journey that had brought them to this point. 6 months ago, he had been a lonely old man with a failing business and a donkey no one wanted. Now he was preparing to fight for justice alongside people who had become his chosen family, in defense of a way of life that honored both tradition and change. That evening, as Walt sat on his porch watching the sunset paint the desert mountains, in shades of gold and crimson, Yiska approached with Biidii, walking beside her. The eagle feather in her hair caught the last rays of sunlight, and Walt was struck again by the transformation he had witnessed in this remarkable child. "Mr. Walt," she said, settling beside him on the wooden steps, "are you frightened about tomorrow?" Walt considered the question honestly. "Yes," he admitted, "I'm frightened that we might lose everything we've worked to build here. But I'm also hopeful, because we're not facing this alone." Yiska nodded solemnly. "Grandmother says fear and hope can live in the same heart. She says the important thing is to choose which one guides your actions." "What do you choose?" Walt asked. The girl reached up to touch her mother's eagle feather, then looked at Biidii, who had positioned himself protectively between them and the approaching darkness. "I choose hope," she said simply, "because Biidii chose hope when he decided to trust us. And look how much better his life became." Walt felt tears prick his eyes at the profound simplicity of her logic. Tomorrow would bring challenges that could destroy everything they had built together. But tonight, sitting beside a wise child and a gentle donkey under the vast Arizona sky, Walt found that hope felt like the most natural choice in the world. In the distance, he could hear Ayanna singing softly in Apache, a traditional song that seemed to weave together past and future, loss and possibility, sorrow and joy. It was the sound of a people who had survived everything the world could throw at them, and who still believed in the possibility of better days ahead. Tomorrow, they would find out if that belief was strong enough to overcome the forces of greed and prejudice that threatened their small community. But tonight, they had each other, and that felt like enough to build any future on. The railroad survey stakes had been driven into the ground during Fletcher Morrison's confident days, and they still stood like small monuments to greed and deception. Judge Crawford examined them with the kind of methodical attention he brought to all evidence, running his fingers along the metal markers while Morrison's defense attorney explained their significance. "These stakes represent legally authorized survey work," the lawyer insisted, his voice carrying the practiced confidence of someone accustomed to courtroom victories. "My client was operating under proper permits, following established territorial development protocols." Judge Crawford, a weathered man in his 60s who had earned his reputation for fairness during 20 years on the territorial bench, said nothing. He simply continued his examination of the stakes, occasionally glancing toward the small crowd gathered around Walt's trading post. The field hearing had drawn an unexpected audience. Beyond the official participants, lawyers, court reporters, federal investigators, curious townspeople had arrived throughout the morning. Some came to support Walt and the Apache families, others drawn by simple curiosity about the unprecedented outdoor legal proceeding. The atmosphere felt more like a community gathering than a formal trial. Walt stood with Yiska and Ayanna near Biidi's pen, trying to project calm confidence, while his stomach churned with anxiety. The donkey seemed to sense the tension, staying close to the fence and watching the proceedings with his usual alert intelligence. "The survey stakes are fraudulent," Colonel Patterson stated firmly, producing his folder of evidence. "They were placed without proper federal approval, in direct violation of existing treaty obligations to the Apache Nation." Morrison's lawyer barely glanced at the documents. Colonel Patterson's so-called evidence consists of decades-old military records and unverified claims about treaty rights that were superseded by subsequent territorial agreements. Judge Crawford finally looked up from his examination of the stakes. "Mr. Morrison," he addressed Fletcher directly, "you've been unusually quiet during these proceedings. Do you have anything to add to your attorney's statements?" Fletcher, who had been released on bail pending the hearing, stepped forward with obvious reluctance. His usual arrogant confidence had been replaced by the nervous energy of a man whose carefully constructed plans were unraveling. "Your Honor, I've devoted years of my life to bringing progress to this territory. The railroad development I've proposed would create jobs, connect isolated communities, bring prosperity to everyone in the region, including yourself," Judge Crawford observed dryly. "Of course, including myself. I'm not a charity, Your Honor, but the benefits would extend far beyond my personal interests." Walt found himself studying Morrison's body language, noting the practiced sincerity that didn't quite reach his eyes. Beside him, Biidii had moved to the corner of his pen closest to the proceedings, his ears forward and his attention completely focused on Fletcher. "What about the Apache families whose water rights would be affected?" Judge Crawford asked. Fletcher's expression hardened slightly. "The Apache claims are based on documents from a different era, Your Honor. The territory has evolved since then. We can't allow ancient agreements to prevent legitimate economic development." As if responding to some invisible signal, Biidii suddenly let out a loud, harsh bray, the first time Walt had heard such a sound from him since Yiska's arrival months ago. The noise cut through Fletcher's testimony like an accusation, and several people in the crowd turned to stare at the donkey. "Interesting timing," Judge Crawford murmured, looking toward the pen where Biidii stood with his head raised and his ears pinned back in obvious agitation. Morrison's lawyer attempted to regain control of the narrative. "Your Honor, we can't allow farmyard animals to disrupt legal proceedings. This entire outdoor setting is highly irregular and prejudicial to my client's rights." But Judge Crawford was already walking toward the corral, his curiosity clearly piqued. "I understand this donkey played a role in the events leading to these proceedings." Walt stepped forward, his heart pounding. "Yes, sir. Biidii, that's his name. He's become something of a community mascot. The Apache families have a special connection with him." "Biidii," the judge repeated, trying the pronunciation carefully. "That's an Apache word?" "It means the one who brings hope," Yiska said clearly, stepping up beside Walt with the kind of courage that continued to amaze him. Her mother's eagle feather caught the morning sunlight, and she looked every inch the descendant of warriors. Judge Walt. Crawford looked down at the small girl with obvious interest. "And you must be Yiska, Ayana's granddaughter. I've read the reports about your family's history." "Yes, sir," Yiska replied politely. "This is our land, our water, our home. So I understand. Tell me, what do you think should happen here?" Walt held his breath, knowing that everything might depend on how an 8-year-old girl answered that question. Yiska looked at Biidii, who had calmed but remained alert, then at the survey stakes that represented everything wrong with Fletcher's. "Approach to progress, I think," she said carefully, "that there should be room for everyone. Apache people and white people, old ways and new ways, but not room for people who build their success by hurting others." Her simple wisdom hung in the morning air like a benediction. Judge Crawford nodded slowly, then looked directly at Fletcher. "Morrison, Mr. Morrison, this child makes a compelling point. Progress built on deception and the dispossession of others isn't progress at all. It's simply theft, dressed up in legal language." Fletcher's face flushed with anger and desperation. "Your Honor, you can't base a legal decision on the sentimental attachment of a child to a piece of desert wasteland." The words were barely out of his mouth when Biidii moved. The great donkey approached the fence separating him from the proceedings and looked directly at Fletcher with an expression that Walt could only describe as contempt. Then, with deliberate precision, Biidii turned his back on Fletcher and walked to where Yiska stood. The symbolism was unmistakable, and Walt saw several members of the crowd exchange meaningful glances. Even Judge Crawford's normally impassive expression showed a hint of amusement. "Desert wasteland, you say?" the judge observed. "Strange how this wasteland has managed to support life for generations and continues to bring out the best in both animals and people." Walt felt a surge of hope as he recognized the shift in Judge Crawford's tone. The outdoor setting was working in their favor, allowing the judge to see not just legal documents, but the living reality of what was at stake. The territory land deed that Colonel Patterson produced from his dispatch case was not just a legal document. It was a piece of history written in fading ink and sealed with official wax that had cracked with age. Judge Crawford examined it with the reverence due to something that had shaped the destiny of the American West. "This deed," Patterson explained, "establishes the original Apache water rights to this creek and the surrounding watershed. It was signed by Territorial Governor Samuel Hayes in 1868, witnessed by 3 federal commissioners, and filed with the Bureau of Indian Affairs." Morrison's lawyer reached for the document, but Judge Crawford held onto it, studying the signatures and seals with professional expertise. "These appear to be authentic federal markings. Mr. Morrison, do you have documentation that supersedes this agreement?" Fletcher shifted uncomfortably, and Walt could see sweat beading on his forehead despite the cool morning air. "Your Honor, there have been numerous subsequent agreements, boundary adjustments, policy changes. I asked for documentation, not generalities," Judge Crawford said firmly. "Do you have specific legal instruments that void this treaty?" The silence that followed was deafening. Morrison's lawyer shuffled through his papers with increasing desperation, but Walt could see from his expression that he was coming up empty. "The Railroad Commission has eminent domain authority," the lawyer finally said, grasping at legal straws. Critical infrastructure projects supersede individual property claims, but not treaty obligations to sovereign native nations. Patterson countered smoothly. Federal law is clear on this point. Treaty rights can only be modified by specific congressional action, not by territorial commissions or private development companies. Judge Crawford nodded slowly. Colonel Patterson is correct. The legal hierarchy is unambiguous in this matter. He looked directly at Fletcher Morrison. Mr. Morrison, I'm going to ask you a direct question, and I expect a direct answer. Did you know about this treaty when you began your development plans? Fletcher's face went through a series of expressions: anger, calculation, fear, and finally resignation. Walt found himself holding his breath, aware that everything hinged on this moment. I knew there were historical claims, Fletcher admitted reluctantly, but I believed they had been superseded by modern territorial law. It was a careful non-answer, and Judge Crawford clearly recognized it as such. That's not what I asked. Did you specifically know about this 1868 treaty? Yiska stepped forward then, her small voice cutting through the tension like a blade. He knew, she said with absolute certainty. His father knew when he attacked our families at White Mountain. Greek, the water rights were why he wanted our people gone. The accusation hung in the air, and Walt saw Fletcher's face go pale. Morrison's lawyer started to object, but Judge Crawford raised his hand for silence. Young lady, that's a serious accusation. Do you have evidence to support it? Yiska reached into her pouch and pulled out her father's cavalry medal, the same one Walt had noticed on her first visit. But now she also withdrew something else, a folded piece of paper that Walt had never seen before. My father kept papers, she said, walking toward the judge with dignity far beyond her years. Grandmother saved them. This one talks about the water treaty. It talks about Captain Morrison's orders to remove Apache families so the government could sell our land. Ayana stepped forward to stand beside her granddaughter, speaking in Apache to give the girl encouragement. Walt watched this exchange of female strength across generations and felt his throat tighten with emotion. Judge Crawford accepted the paper and read it carefully, his expression growing increasingly grim. When he looked up, his eyes were hard as flint. Mr. Morrison, he said quietly, this document appears to be a military communication discussing plans to void Apache water rights through forced relocation. It's signed by Captain T. Morrison. Any relation to you? Fletcher's composure finally cracked completely. That was 30 years ago. Ancient history. You can't hold me responsible for military decisions made before I was even in business. But you were aware of those decisions when you began this land grab, Judge Crawford observed. You knew your development plans were built on a foundation of violence and legal manipulation. Walt watched Fletcher Morrison's empire of lies collapse in real time. The man who had threatened their community, who had wanted to turn Biidii into a circus attraction and force Apache families from their ancestral water source, was finally being held accountable for his family's legacy of cruelty. Your Honor, Patterson said formally, based on this evidence and Mr. Morrison's own admissions, the federal government is prepared to file charges of conspiracy to violate treaty rights, fraudulent land claims, and attempted theft of federal property. Judge Crawford nodded gravely. Mr. Morrison, you are hereby ordered to cease all development activities on the disputed land. The railroad survey stakes will be removed immediately, and you will face federal prosecution for your illegal activities. He turned to Walt and the Apache families, his stern expression softening. As for the rightful owners of this land, the treaty is clear and valid. The water rights belong to Ayana's people, with Mr. Garrison's trading post operating under their sufferance and protection. Walt felt tears of relief start in his eyes. Not only had they won, but they had won in a way that honored both justice and friendship. The land would remain in the hands of people who understood its true value. Yiska ran to Biidi's pen and threw her arms around the donkey's neck. "We did it, Biidii," she whispered. "We saved our home." The donkey lowered his great head to nuzzle the girl's hair, and Walt was struck once again by the bonds of love and loyalty that had made their victory possible. Justice had been served, but more importantly, a community had been preserved. A community built on mutual respect, shared wisdom, and the simple recognition that everyone deserves a place to call home. The hand-carved wooden sign was a masterpiece of collaboration, created over 3 weeks of careful work in the cool shade of Walt's porch. Walt provided the wood, a piece of seasoned pine that had been aging in his storage shed for years, while Yiska contributed the design and most of the delicate carving work. Her small hands proved surprisingly skilled with the tools, and Walt found himself marveling at how quickly she learned techniques that had taken him decades to master. 6 months had passed since Judge Crawford's landmark ruling, and the changes around the trading post reflected their transformed circumstances. The most visible difference was Walt's flourishing business, not from livestock trading, which remained modest, but from visitors who came specifically to meet the famous Hope donkey and the Apache girl who had captured the territory's imagination. But Yiska had insisted that fame should not change Biidii's essential nature. "He is still the same gentle soul," she reminded Walt whenever well-meaning visitors suggested elaborate displays or performances. "He helps people by being himself, not by pretending to be something else." The new sign reflected that philosophy. Instead of advertising livestock and feed, it now read, "Garrison and Yiska's Trading Post, all creatures welcome." Below the words, Yiska had carved an intricate design, showing a donkey, an eagle, and a human figure standing together beside flowing water. It was beautiful work that told their story better than any words could. Walt held the sign steady while Yiska made final adjustments to the lettering. His eyesight had continued to deteriorate over the past months, but he'd discovered that Yiska's presence made the limitation far less frightening. She had become his eyes in many ways, describing details he could no longer see clearly and guiding him through tasks that required fine visual discrimination. "There," Yiska said with satisfaction, stepping back to admire their work. "Now everyone will know this is a place where different kinds of people can be friends." Walt smiled, running his fingers over the carved surface to feel the textures his eyes could no longer distinguish. "It's beautiful work, little partner. Your mother would be proud." The word partner had become their preferred term for their relationship. Walt was not Yiska's father, and she was not his daughter, but they had become something deeper than friends, chosen family bound together by mutual respect and shared purpose. Catherine Mills arrived just as they were hanging the new sign, riding her mare with her usual graceful competence. Her visits had become a cherished part of Walt's weekly routine, and he felt his heart lift at the sight of her approaching. "Perfect timing," Catherine called out as she dismounted. "I wanted to see the sign before the celebration tonight." The celebration she referred to was a community gathering to mark the first anniversary of Yiska's naming of Biidii, an event that had grown from a simple personal milestone into something approaching a local holiday. Families from throughout the territory planned to attend, including several Apache bands who had traveled from distant settlements to honor the girl whose courage had helped secure their water rights. "Dr. Henderson is bringing his whole family," Catherine continued, tying her horse to the hitching post, "and Colonel Patterson sent word that he'll be arriving this afternoon with some special guests from the territorial capital." Walt felt a familiar flutter of nervousness at the mention of official visitors, but Yiska seemed entirely untroubled by the prospect of meeting important strangers. "Biidii likes meeting new people now," she said matter-of-factly, walking over to where the donkey stood in his pen. "He was lonely before, but now he knows he is loved. That makes everything easier." As if responding to her words, Biidii approached the fence and allowed Yiska to stroke his muzzle. The transformation in the animal over the past year was remarkable. Where once he had been withdrawn and suspicious, he now radiated a calm confidence that seemed to put visitors at ease. The afternoon brought a steady stream of arrivals. Apache. Families set up traditional shelters near the creek, their children playing in the shallow water while their parents prepared food and shared stories. Townspeople from Copper Springs arrived with wagons full of contributions to the communal feast, and Walt was touched by how naturally the two communities blended together. Ayana, now nearing 70 but still vigorous, had assumed the role of unofficial elder for the gathering. She moved between groups with quiet authority, translating when necessary and ensuring that traditional protocols were observed. Walt noticed that she wore her finest dress and jewelry for the occasion, clearly, recognizing the historical significance of the event. She says, "This is the first time in 30 years that Apache and white families have celebrated together without fear," Dr. Henderson translated, having become surprisingly fluent in basic Apache phrases through his medical work with the community. As the sun began to set, Colonel Patterson arrived with his promised special guests, 3 federal officials from Washington who had come to study the successful resolution of the land dispute. Walt watched nervously as they examined the thriving community that had grown around his trading post, wondering what bureaucratic minds made of such an unconventional success story. But Yiska, as always, charmed the visitors with her straightforward honesty and obvious intelligence. She showed them around the property, explained Biidii's role in bringing people together, and answered their questions about Apache traditional knowledge with the kind of depth that impressed educated adults. "This child is remarkable." One of the federal officials told Walt quietly. Her insights into cross-cultural cooperation could inform policy throughout the Western territories. Walt felt a surge of protective pride, but also concern about the implications of such attention. "She's still just a child," he reminded the official. "She needs time to grow up before she starts informing federal policy." The man smiled. "Of course, but when she's ready, there will be opportunities. The territory needs leaders who understand how to build bridges instead of walls." As darkness fell and the celebration moved into its evening phase, Walt found himself standing beside the creek with Biidii, watching the mingled Apache and white families sharing food and stories around carefully tended fires. The scene before him would have been unthinkable a year ago, yet now it felt like the most natural thing in the world. Yiska approached them, her eagle feather ornament gleaming in the firelight and her face glowing with happiness. "Are you content, Mr. Walt?" she asked, using a phrase Ayana had taught her for expressing deep satisfaction. Walt looked around at the peaceful gathering, at the friends who had become family, at the community that had grown from the simple act of a child showing kindness to an unloved donkey. His trading post was thriving, his partnership with Yiska was stronger than ever, and his relationship with Catherine was deepening into something that felt like a second chance at love. Most importantly, the guilt that had haunted him for 20 years had been replaced by a sense of purpose and belonging that he'd never expected to find again. "Yes, little partner," he said, putting his arm around her shoulders. "I am very content indeed." Biidii, as if sensing the moment's significance, moved closer to them both. The great donkey, who had once been rejected by everyone, now stood as the gentle center of a community built on understanding and mutual respect. In the distance, Walt could hear Ayana singing one of her traditional songs, a melody that seemed to weave together past and future, loss and hope, sorrow and joy. It was the sound of healing, of walls coming down, of different peoples learning to see each other as neighbors rather than strangers. As Walt listened to that ancient song while watching firelight dance on the faces of friends, both old and new, he realized that sometimes the most important journeys begin not with grand plans or noble intentions, but with simple acts of kindness offered when no one else is watching. Yiska had seen worth in a donkey that everyone else dismissed. She had offered friendship to an old man carrying more guilt than he knew how to bear, and from those small seeds of compassion had grown something beautiful and strong enough to change not just individual lives, but an entire community's understanding of what was possible when people chose hope over fear. The weathered trading post sign that had greeted visitors for so many years was gone now, replaced by their hand-carved announcement that all creatures were welcome. But the real change wasn't in the sign. It was in the hearts of the people who had learned to see possibility where others saw only problems. Walt smiled and pulled Yiska closer, while Biidii stood beside them like a gentle guardian watching over dreams that had finally found their way home.